Um, sorry for the delay, everyone. As you've probably gathered, we're just waiting. So we've got a speaker who would have been presenting, I think in terms of the time zone, I think it may be that he is currently in Colombia. And I have realized just in conversation with someone else that there's the difference between Australian Eastern Standard Time and Australian Eastern Daylight Standard Time. And I am wondering whether some people are logging in an hour later, because if you don't know, it's daylight saving. Anyway, so there could be that issue. So look, if Camilo comes in an hour's time, the more the merrier, and it'll be great to hear his paper and chat to him. But otherwise, I'm very happy that we have lots of time to talk. And Eduardo is very generously prepared to field many questions over a long period of time. Just a very quick introduction to Eduardo, and many of you do know him. Eduardo Guerra, the title of his project, his thesis and his paper, Mnemonic Guerillas, Creative Activism and the Politics of Memory in the Brazilian Post-Dictatorship. Eduardo is a Latin American, a Brazilian, and a Nordestino. Nordestino, so I said that right. He's also a PhD candidate in UTS's Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, where he teaches and researches. He's formally trained in communication and visual arts in Brazil, and he has since been investigating the potential of aesthetic political practices in facilitating participatory experiences and challenging the limits of our current democracies. Guerra's current research focuses on memory activism in the Brazilian post-dictatorship. By talking with third-generation activists and reflecting upon the current political dictatorial memory in Brazil, he explores micro-macro intersections within the process of disputing narratives about traumatic past. Give a warm welcome to Eduardo. Very excited.
Thanks, Tim. And thanks, everyone, for coming. Just so you know, Tim is my supervisor as well. Okay. I'm very lucky to have Tim as my supervisor. So yeah, thanks for the introduction. My name is Luiz Eduardo Quintão Guerra. You can just call me Eduardo. I'm a PhD student here, just finishing my PhD this year. So please pray for me. I hope everything will be okay. And I'm also a tutor here in the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences. I'm also a proud member of Hunar. Let me take this up. The collective that is responsible for putting this great event. We have been planning this for a while, so it's very, very nice to see it happening. Finally, it's been like 1 year we have been planning this. And it's very good to present my research as well. So I just wanted to first thank everyone involved in this event. The collective itself, the volunteers, everyone who presented their papers, keynote speakers, such as Saranina from Collective Aparecidos Políticos, which is part of my research. She's a participant of my research. Art Lords, Badiukal, and just a reminder that today at 6 p.m. we'll have the opening of our exhibition at UTS Gallery Building 6. I hope you are enjoying this event. I hope you engage with our collective and help us putting more events like this. So I'll start with the name of our conference, Art and Conflict, which, in my opinion, allows for different connections between these two terms, art and conflict. But I believe in all the possible connections. We can talk about different types of art. We can talk about intrinsic necessity of art, like art critic Ernest Fisher would say, art worlds, like Howard Becker would say. We can talk about different types of conflict. We can talk about conflict as a necessary part of democracy. We can talk about internal conflicts as well. But in all these connections, there is a dimension of memory that I think is very relevant to bring to this event, simply because we are constantly recalling past experiences to inform our decisions in the present, be them towards construction or destruction. So we make sense of our present using the conceptual map provided by the past. Or as Marx once said, men make their own history, but under the circumstances transmitted from the past. But according to Argentinian sociologist Elizabeth Helling, memories are the object of disputes, conflicts, and struggles. And this premise involves the need to focus attention on the active and productive role of participants in these struggles, because it is they who generate meanings of the past, framed by the power relations in which their actions are embedded in the present. So basically, for the past 3 years, I have been investigating this active and productive role of participants, which I call memory activists. Elizabeth Helling calls memory entrepreneurs. Who are the participants of my research? I have been interviewing different participants from different collectives in these past 3 years, mostly on Zoom because of COVID. But now in July, I was able actually to travel to Brazil and do some interviews in person, which actually added a lot to my research. It's very different when you interview someone on Zoom, online, virtually, and when you see them in their environment and they pull up documents and they show the archive, they share the archives with you. So today I'm going to present a little bit of my research. Basically, I will talk about one of the projects of memory activism that I analyzed. These are all projects that I have been analyzing from different collectives, such as street demonstrations, people changing the names and monuments of parks, of squares. For example, this one on the upper right is from Aparecidos Políticos. There was a square in front of a former torture center. They took out the monument, they put out this monument, which simulates someone having like a plastic bag that was a form of torture that was used during the dictatorship. And they named this square of the politically disappeared. They put a new plaque and everything, a metal plaque. This one was is a bridge in Brasilia, the capital of Brazil, which is named after one of our biggest dictators. And then this collective in 2018, after the death of Councilor Marielle Franco, they changed the name of the bridge to Bridge Marielle Franco. This other one is an Occupy movement trying to transform a former torture center of torture in a site of memory. This other one is also very interesting, a collective that tried to create a National Truth Commission about the crimes committed in the present. So it's a National Truth Commission about the torture crimes and human rights violations that happened in the present. But I'm going to look into one of the collectives that I have studied, which is called Coletivo Político Quem, which can be translated as Collective Political Who. And I'll try to demonstrate how they appropriated an artistic procedure of the so-called Brazilian 1970s guerrilla art within the political circumstances of 2011. So I want to begin by having a look at this artwork by Cildo Meirelles, which is called Inserções em Circuitos Ideológicos, Projeto Cédula, Quem Matou Herzog. Can be translated as Insertions into Ideological Circuits, Project Banknote, Who Killed Herzog. This work was developed between 1970 and 1975 during one of the most violent periods of the Brazilian dictatorship. By the beginning of the 70s, Meirelles, the artist, was already interested in circuits of exchange as a form of institutional criticism and a form as well of avoiding the military surveillance and censorship that affected the art world and mass communication venues. In this sense, he started using money notes to write political messages such as Yankees Go Home. Our dictatorship was a right-wing dictatorship supported by the United States, as most Latin American dictatorships were, or Down with the Dictatorship. But in 1975, the artist revisited this project after journalist Herzog's assassination and stamped banknotes with the question, who killed Herzog, putting them back into circulation. So just a little contextualization, Herzog was a famous journalist and a professor at the University of São Paulo. And in 1975, he was summoned to appear at the Military Center of Internal Defense, known as DOICODE, which also served as a torture center. So he went to the center by himself to speak before military authorities, but he never left. He was killed during a torture session, and in his death certificate forged by the military, they said suicide by hanging. The military also staged a photograph to simulate his hanging, which circulated in newspapers and history books and became a very symbolic image related to the Brazilian dictatorial repression. Even nowadays, if you write on Google his name, Vladimir Herzog, the first image is going to be this image of himself hanged in the police room, which was forged. They even put a chair in front of his hands because his nail was all messed up because of the torture, his fingers. So he put a chair. They staged all the photograph so they could use it to disseminate their version that he had hung himself with a belt, they said, but actually prisoners didn't have belts, weren't given belts. So, of course, despite the effort of the military version, it wasn't accepted by the public. Even the rabbi that was responsible for Herzog's funeral, Herzog was a Jewish person, he refused to bury him as someone who committed suicide, as this is such a violation to Jewish law. So in this sense, the artist's question, who killed Herzog, was rather a rhetorical question to emphasize that the official explanation was falsely generated to mask the real causes of his death. So by asking who killed Herzog, the artist was doing more than just inquiring about the authorship of the crime. He was actually confronting the official version of suicide given by the military. For this reason, as art historian Claudia Kalimann tells us, these banknotes did not last long in the hands of the recipients, because everyone was scared to having these notes with them. People would neither keep them in their pockets nor rip them up because it was too money. So they kept it circulating quickly. Another art historian, Elena Stromberg, in her studies about Meirelles' money-based artworks, says that these banknotes not only ask the viewer to state the obvious, that the victim died in the hands of the police, but also to circulate this instigation by engaging in daily monetary transactions. So Meirelles' experiment demonstrates how dominant systems that organize society, such as currency, also constitute a place for the development of relationships between people. And as such, these systems can also be explored to circulate political messages. So the success of Meirelles' banknotes derived from his use of an existing circulation system, but also from the viewer's unexpectedness. So by repurposing banknotes to serve as a support for anti-regime expressions, the artist could take the viewer by surprise. And in this sense, art critic Frederico Moraes during the 70s classified the works produced by Meirelles as well as by other conceptual artists in the 70s as guerrilla art. That's how Meirelles would classify their works, as guerrilla art. So this was taken from an article written by Moraes, by Frederico Moraes, this art critic, about this type of work that people were doing in the 70s. He said, the artist today is a type of guerrilla fighter. Art is a form of ambush, acting suddenly where and when it is least expected in an unusual way, because everything today can become an instrument of war or art. The artist creates a permanent state of tension, a constant expectation. Everything can be transformed into art, even the most ordinary everyday event. The spectator, a constant victim of artistic guerrilla, finds themselves obliged to activate their senses. So this was in the 1970s. Now let's jump to 2011. About 36 years after Meirelles stamped his banknotes with the question, who killed Herzog? These other banknotes started circulating, questioning who tortured Dilma Rousseff. Just another quick contextualization. Dilma Rousseff was a member of a resistance group during the dictatorship. She was arrested and tortured by different military staff for many days. She survived, and in 2011, as many of you might know, she became Brazil's president, signing the law that created the first National Truth Commission, an initiative that ignited discussion amongst members of the government and the military, who of course didn't want their crimes to be investigated. But at the same time, this initiative of the National Truth Commission also encouraged young activists to engage with this struggle for memory, truth, and justice, and to demand even stronger actions from the government. So they were supporting the government against the military, who didn't want the National Truth Commission to be installed. But at the same time, they were demanding the government to be even stronger with these actions. So some of these activists reunited in collectives in different parts of the country. And one example is this collective, Coletivo Político Quem. I'll be referring to them as CPQ sometimes. And this collective was formed by students at the University of São Paulo, where Herzog used to teach. And they started trying to raise awareness about what was the dictatorship. And one of their actions was reproducing Meirelles' work and circulating the question, who tortured Dilma Rousseff, on banknotes, but also on signs, doing some pay stubs around the city of São Paulo. Also, they started organizing debates and developing other artistic political interventions in academic contexts, but also in the streets of São Paulo. So drawing on an interview with one of its founding members, Rafael, and on the visual and textual documentation of the collective's activities, I analyzed this project to understand the influence of past anti-dictatorial artworks in contemporary memory conflicts. And to what concerns my presentation today, it's important, I think, to observe the political circumstances surrounding the encounter between younger activists and past artworks. In this sense, Rafael told me in interview that he saw Cildo Meirelles' banknotes, and at that moment, it started ringing in his head. We have Dilma. It could be her name stamped there. It was during that time when that broth was boiling around the creation of the National Truth Commission. It was during Dilma's government. She was our president. And then I saw this exhibition and I thought I could redo this. So the idea of creating the stamps precedes the idea of creating the collective. So what I want to highlight here is that the impact of Meirelles' work on Rafael during that time when that broth was boiling around the creation of the National Truth Commission during Dilma's government is illustrative of the role of present political circumstances to the impact of past artworks. Rafael was impacted by Meirelles' anti-dictatorial artwork because the discussions about the dictatorship were boiling during that time. So as I argue in my thesis, the lack of meaningful answers to pressing questions about past atrocities, such as who killed Herzog, is responsible for conserving their urgency across time. And the changes in political circumstances, such as those observed during the creation of the Brazilian National Truth Commission, are responsible for enabling opportunities for bringing these questions to the public sphere so younger generations can engage with and elaborate the responses to it. It is also important to note that Meirelles' work was conceived initially for circulating outside galleries and museums and confronting institutional circuits of art. But despite Meirelles' desire, his series, The Insertions into Ideological Circuits, was readily displayed at one of the art world's most recognized institutions, the Museum of Modern Art in New York, in 1970. And in 2011, a group of young activists took Meirelles' work outside institutional art spaces back to circulating in the streets. But interestingly, in interview, when I asked Rafael about the role of institutional spaces, and I thought he would be kind of anti-institutions and etc., because he was taking Meirelles' work out of an institution, bringing it to the street. But this is what he replied. If Cildo Meirelles had not done that, and that wasn't exhibited in the Biennale, maybe the collective would not exist. And if it did, probably would not have this artistic side. So this idea of the banknotes only happened because the example already existed and was exhibited in an institutional space. So the stamp allowed the collective to exist. Art, and by art, I understand institutionalized discourses and spaces of art, allowed the collective to exist. So while Meirelles' project aimed to criticize art institutions, but quickly engaged with them, Rafael praised the role of institutional spaces of art and their organized discourses in the creation of his activist project that took it outside, back to the streets. I think these opposite opinions, these opposite movements can contribute to discussions about the possibilities and constraints of artworks when placed in institutional or public spaces, in conventional or unconventional spaces, in the galleries, white cubes, or on the street. But in my presentation today, what I want to emphasize is that this perception about the importance of institutional spaces was brought up by other activists that I have interviewed. Many refer to the expression one foot inside, the other outside, to describe the importance of occupying institutional spaces and the streets. I argue that this perception was enabled by the political circumstances of the democratic time. By that, I mean that they consider important occupying institutional spaces because they saw these spaces as accessible and less censored, of course, than during the dictatorship. So Meirelles' project combined urban guerrillas and conceptual art to open up a space to denounce the crimes committed by the dictatorship, and was almost 40 years later appropriated by young activists to denounce the ongoing silence about these crimes. In this sense, to wrap it up, what I want to highlight here is that in post-dictatorial Brazil, our political conflicts and our artistic responses to them are connected to the residues of the military regime and to the ways we address them in our democracy. And by we, I mean civil society and government institutions together in constant dialogue. However, if this dialogue is not sustained, the residues of the military regime will remain active. So I presented here one example of an aesthetic political expression that was inspired by Meirelles' banknote project of the 70s. But there are other examples that I could bring here. For example, Cildo Meirelles himself revisited his past project after the death of Amarildo de Souza, a bricklayer who was tortured, killed, and disappeared by the police in July 2013. So Meirelles produced a banknote and stamped bills with the rhetorical question, where is Amarildo? And in 2018, after the assassination of Rio de Janeiro's councillor Marielle Franco, Cildo Meirelles again revisited his project and questioned who killed Marielle. And just a quick parenthesis, it's been almost 5 years, we still don't know. So to conclude, I would like to restate that within this relationship between art and conflict, there is a dimension of memory that should not be overlooked by artists, by activists or researchers trying to understand and address the urgent questions of our time. Marx wrote in his 18th of Brumaire that men make history, but with the meanings inherited by the past. But if the past, as we saw in the beginning, is in constant dispute, then we make history while also disputing history. We make history while trying to find meaningful answers to ongoing questions that come from the past. I'll just end by repeating what I said in the beginning, that in post-dictatorial Brazil, the lack of meaningful answers to pressing questions about past atrocities is responsible for conserving the urgency across time. And they are urgent because some questions, when they remain unanswered, they multiply, as we can see, across time. So this is my contribution for today. Thanks everyone for coming to my presentation.
Thank you so much.
Some references.
Thank you so much, Eduardo. And as we mentioned before, we have plenty of time for questions. And I would just jump in and also say hello to Yumi, who's online with us as well. And maybe is there one other person, Jess as well. So if you have any questions, feel free to also turn on your cameras and mics and ask them, or pop it in the chat. And of course, we welcome questions from the floor. Does someone want to start us off? Do you want to hop back in the frame? And
Yeah.
Actually, if you want to come up here, oh yeah, we could use the lapel.
Yeah, we can use the lapel because I stand up there. I don't know if it's working. Taking over. I just want to make sure everyone can hear.
I'll give it a to the button. Let's get a second. Yeah. There it is. Let's see. This.
All right, hi, this is Matthew. Can people on Zoom hear me? Just give me a thumbs up if you can hear us.
I guess if they can't, then they won't.
And what I really love that, emphasize the absolute love of that. A couple of things without trying to hold the floor. As a geographer, you know, we share an interest in memory. We think about landscape, the memory of landscape. Struck me as you were speaking at the end that the banknotes are a landscape of their own, you know, an official landscape of power, you know, very carefully curated. And I love the way that the examples you've spoken about basically subvert that landscape. I guess my question though is, have the banknotes, particularly those, you know, stamped with Herzog from the 70s, have they become collector's items? Have they entered into the kind of global market as desirable artifacts for people to collect?
Thanks, Matthew.
I've got to follow up. If the answer is yes, I've got to follow up.
No,
if the answer is no, I'm
No, the answer, I'll have to say it's no. These banknotes by themselves, as I said, in the 70s, they went to the MoMA, to the Museum of Modern Art, and also to other museums. And as Rafael said, he saw it for the first time in a Biennale in São Paulo, in a museum. But it didn't become items that people would collect, especially because the dictatorship wasn't something that people were talking about until 2007, 2008, when we started talking more about it. Even Sildo's work, I would see them maybe in history books, something like that, but it didn't become something that was kind of collectivized. It wasn't famous outside the art world itself.
Okay, so that sort of closed off the questions, but I guess the question was leading to.
Yeah.
I'm always fascinated about the operation of power and how power recasts itself in the circuits of capital, and the way that subversive art becomes mainstream through a commodification process that, you know, is potentially disrespectful of the original intent of the artist and the message that was included. It just becomes commodity for consumption and for capital accumulation.
Yeah, I agree with you. The artist's original idea was for it to circulate in the street, but when the Museum of Modern Art invited him, he said, yes, cool, that you can exhibit my work. But at the same time, I think something important to consider is that these systems, these powerful systems, search systems that connect us, they can also be hijacked. They can be hijacked and taken to the streets, or we can occupy these systems as well. And this is what I'd like to highlight in this presentation. This is what I talk a lot in my thesis, because most of my participants, they are not anti-institutions. They are not against institutions. They say we have to occupy institutions. Even people like that have a more anarchist type of thought, that are, for example, against police brutality in Brazil. One of the solutions is join the police and change it from inside as well. It can sound a little bit weird, but in our democratic times, we started realizing that it is possible, and especially during the Labour's government, and I'm not saying that it was the best government or anything, but they actually dialogued with social movements. So activists, social movements, they started feeling themselves represented. Some people that I interviewed, they started working for the government as well in the National Truth Commission. The government gave medals to activists that were outside former torturers' house, putting tags and graffiti, calling them torturers, and the government gave medals to these people doing graffiti on the street. So I think, that is this dialogue between institutional spaces and non-institutional spaces, conventional spaces and unconventional spaces. I think it's important for researchers, activists, and artists to be aware of how to occupy both, how to use both to their objectives. That's what I try to talk a little bit today, and that's what I try to talk in my thesis as well. The importance of government initiatives in activating young activists, and the importance of these youth to contribute to update these initiatives that were done by the government.
Awesome. Yeah. Thanks, mate. I also just love it. Really powerful.
Thank you. Thank you.
So much, Eduardo. Following on from Matthew's question, one is, how much do your participants talk about the risks of the conservatizing influence of those institutions that they're happy to join and be a part of, the risks of change from within? And then the other question I had was around, can you tell us more about the Truth Commission that Congress has set up, and how that's seen by the population? Is it seen very, generally very popular, encouraging way, and the role of it in preserving memory or digging into memory in terms of using that to then strengthen current Brazilian democracy?
Yeah, thanks for these questions. I'll start with the second one. So the National Truth Commission was, it began in 2012. It was signed in 2011, by the end of 2011, began in 2012. But even in the description of the commission itself, in the form of the official description, they say that they are looking to investigate and to deliver memory and truth. They don't talk about justice. The movement is memory, truth, and justice. That's what the relatives were asking since the dictatorship ended. People were tortured, people were killed, people were disappeared, and they wanted to judge these people. They wanted to make them go through some sort of legal procedure to frame them as criminals, because they were criminals. And the National Truth Commission didn't do that. This was one of the first mistakes. The other mistake was not making this public enough. The public hearings were constantly not well disseminated, because we have to understand, it's a common place to say that the National Truth Commission wasn't enough, and it wasn't. But at the same time, it was in constant dispute with military, because military are still in power. We can see in the last government that we had, Bolsonaro, it's ending now, thank God. But they have more military in this government than in the dictatorship. So military are still there, are still present. So for me, my opinion is that National Truth Commission didn't do enough. That's why Bolsonaro is still there in power. That's why 2 years after the National Truth Commission, they had like the report, the final report, 3 volumes, big book with all the names of the perpetrators. One of the perpetrators, one of the biggest tortured many people, he was praised by Bolsonaro. And people started praising this torturer. People have shirts with the face of one of the most violent torture that we had. So the National Commission didn't do the work, but I understand that it was also very difficult given that the military still holds so much power in Brazil. And the first question was...
Can I just follow up on that?
Yeah, sure.
So was your sense that Rousseff would have liked the justice component in that commission, but because of the pressure of the military, she wasn't able to have that?
Exactly. During the whole process, if you go through the newspapers of that time, you're going to see the government say something, the military would reply with something, saying that this was mere revenge. You're just trying to get your revenge. It's not about justice, it's just trying to frame us as a bad institution, and etc. And people from the government started being like, well, for us to be able to keep doing this, we have to accept some of the demands, some of the military demands. And that's one of the mistakes of our Labour Party, is that it does a lot of conciliations in order to get somewhere. They do get places, they did a very good job, but a lot of the problems that we had was because of this trying to conciliate military in the government. Military should be in their place, not inside government.
The other question was about the conservative influence of institutions and the inside versus outside strategy. And part of my PhD is interviewing climate activists, and there is some debate about, the Greens Party and they've started in social movements, but the more they become entrenched in the state and in the system, the greater the risk of conservative policies and losing some of those ideals of the social movement itself. So just some of the tensions there. Do your participants talk about that?
Yeah, they do talk a lot, and I ask a lot about that as well. But everyone says that the interest began in 2011, 2010. It was around this time, again, Rafael said, when the broth was boiling. And everyone says that, yeah, I started getting interested in this thing about memory, truth, and justice because I saw on the TV, or because I saw the discussions in the newspapers. And then I got interested in trying to help the government to achieve this thing. So they consider the institutions a proper place to be occupied, but they also consider the conservative environment that institutions can be. And I think it's a matter of knowing how to navigate this conservative environment, because within this conservative environment, there are also other people that are not that conservative, specifically talking about the National Truth Commission. There were people that actually wanted for justice to be added, for example, in the National Truth Commission. So, for example, one of the activists that I interviewed, he tried to pass a National Truth Commission to investigate crimes of the present, the human rights violations that were taking place in the present. And they showed to one politician said, well, I can't do this. The other one was like, no, I don't even want to look at it. They kept looking for a politician that would support this. And they found one that said, okay, let's do this. I'll support this. And in the Chamber of Deputies of São Paulo, they created this. They made a public hearing. They got mothers from the favelas that lost their kids by the hands of the police to talk about their experience, to talk about what happened to them. Because normally what they get is just a journalist coming to them just right after it happened and trying to exploit their emotions and etc. And they don't have like a proper hearing. If they have, it's just them and the police. It's not with an audience, it's not with human rights lawyers, and they were able to do that. So there are a lot of limitations working in institutions, but I think that's one of the ways that we can get things done. It's not that we will get things done, but we'll start at least talking about how to occupy institution. It's very difficult. There are a lot of conservative people. It is a conservative environment, but I think as Marielle Franco said, the Councilor of Rio de Janeiro, we need to have one step in, one step out. Be on the street, be in the institutions.
Thank you.
Well, do you have any questions online?
No.
I do have an extra question that I was thinking about just around the artworks themselves, and I wanted to ask this because I don't think we've chatted about this particular element before. I was trying to picture what is like really distinct about the money notes artwork, especially the 70s example. And I was thinking, like, firstly, it's if you receive those notes, then if you feel uncomfortable about it, then you're sort of weirdly put in the position of being an activist, even if you don't agree with the politics.
Yeah.
Right? Because if you're trying to get rid of the money, it's like absolutely anyone on any side of politics, then you have to become an activist just because you're scared of the state capturing you. And in a weird way, that means you also feel the vulnerability of the surveillance of the state, right? So even if you are someone who's very pro-dictatorship in general, you get this money note and you're like, oh, I kind of do know that they illegally arrest people and people are disappeared and tortured, so I've got to get rid of this note.
Yeah.
So I thought this is a really interesting position that puts you in to get it.
Yeah.
So just I was more inviting a comment on that. But then I was also thinking about anonymity, that the murder of Herzog is enabled in part through the anonymity of the dictatorship, right, of the police force. That we'll never know which particular person in that station murdered Herzog. We won't know who gave the order from which level, right? So there's anonymity on that side. But then there's a symmetry of anonymity on the other side, right, from the artist. Because even if you receive that note, you don't know that Silva did it, right? I mean, you know that that he is attributed to being the author of these notes, but you never know if your note is him.
You can always deny it.
Yeah, and of course, if they try and arrest someone or just arrest him for being the author of these notes, he can say, oh, I didn't do those. They were just copycat. So I guess I was thinking there's something interesting about anonymity, right? It's a power that dictatorships have, but it's also a power that artists and activists can claim back. That they have their own power of anonymity. So I guess I'm wondering if there's anything that is interesting to you there about anonymity as a force in this, on both of these sides.
Yeah, totally. I think anonymity was a part of this work. He did this work and he kept circulating because, as you said, no one could accuse him and said, you did this, because how can you prove it? And he, of course, didn't want to get arrested or tortured. So that's one of the reasons he started doing this. But also, I think this anonymity can also encourage other people to do the same thing when they get the notes like, oh, someone did this. I could do that as well. So you can encourage other people to become activists, even if they weren't thinking about becoming an activist, and they can start writing their own message on banknotes as well, which changes in democracy. Herzog did that in the 70s because he needed to. This collective political gain, they didn't need to be anonymous. But at the same time, it still works in 2011 because the question itself is so important, so urgent. And I think the impact and the simplicity of this intervention, which is just getting a money note, we can do this right now with Australian money. I don't know if a pen would work in plastic because our money notes are actually paper. But it's something very simple that everyone can do. So I think the simplicity of this work and its guerrilla style as well of getting someone unexpected, someone that wasn't expecting to get that note and just being surprised by that message, because money, writing things in money is not something uncommon in Brazil. People do write things, especially evangelical message or pornographic drawings as well, or for jokes, is not something very uncommon. But political messages like who take the time to do this and etc. So it's a type of a strategy, a tactic, a guerrilla tactic that still works nowadays in 2011. And yeah, I think anonymity is a part of this because even nowadays you can say that you did that, but sometimes you don't want to get involved in that. It's something that's very simple. You don't need to be an activist. You don't need to be talking about this constantly. You can just get your money, write a message and circulate it. And according to the Brazilian laws, even if the money has things written, it's still values. So people won't throw it away. But at the same time, you can erase it. You can, how to say, write all over it. You can write on the top. So you were saying people in the dictatorship, they had to, but they could actually just do this. But I think in the dictatorship, that was also very important because people actually didn't know that. It wasn't everyone that knew what was going on because the dictatorship has a strong work of propaganda to actually, like my mother, like lives through the dictatorship. She didn't know that was like happening like it was. Only people that were engaged with politics, student movements and workers and unions, student unions and labor unions were the most affected. Like I think more than a half of people that were died and disappeared were either student, professors, or workers, like laborers. So yeah, I think anonymity is a very important part of this work, and getting the person by surprise, taking the person by surprise. I think it's also what makes this work so powerful and still works nowadays.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
I think we've got an expert. Yeah, Steve, do you want to go with this? So I was really thinking about what you were saying just then, Tim, about anonymity. It's on my university's ethics committee. So, you know, we work a lot with people saying, your respondents, they're anonymous. No, they're not, they're confidential because you actually protect their identity. What I was thinking of, particularly from the state's point of view, and given the context, Eduardo, that you've spoken about, that the military is still such a central power structure within the government, maybe it's not about the anonymity of these issues, because ultimately someone knows, and likely there is probably a record of who murdered the dog somewhere, but it's kept confidential. It's not anonymous. And so my brain is, it's really free-forming, but I'm thinking an anonymity, because there is a deliberate and a complicit process of power to protect power.
Yeah.
And very often, you know, this will work, your work, it reveals the power of corruption, power of totalitarianism.
Yep.
And power by its very nature, unglorious reality, it seeks to change itself, seeks to protect itself. And so I think it's a really great idea, that interplay. But I wonder, confidentiality is a dimension of it, you know, as well as anonymity. But confidentiality is still, it's a deliberate choice to protect. That's an observation. Yeah, I agree with you. Also, it's not just about knowing who killed Herzog, because if you're gonna investigate it, you're gonna see that wasn't maybe one person, it was five military at the same time. So it's difficult. I think this question is meant more to generate other questions. It's a question that can be pluralized in other, multiply into other questions and make you think about who is concealing, who is hiding this truth, who is responsible for hiding this truth, why are they hiding this truth? So yeah, I think this work that in that time and in the present day with Dilma as well, with our former president, by asking who tortured Dilma herself, it's like she was tortured by many military. She can recognize, she gave her testimony and etc. And she mentioned 1, 2, 3 people that she remembers that tortured her, and she described their methods and etc. But there were so many other people involved in the torture process, even the doctors. Because when someone was tortured, would take the person to a doctor so the doctor could keep them alive or not. Even the people who wrote death certificates as well, the legal medics, coroner. Yeah. So yeah, there are a lot of people involved. So by asking a specific question, who killed this person? I think it makes a big impact and makes you think that actually it's not one person. It makes you think who contributed to keep this killing, this assassination hidden, who contributed to silence, who finances this, who financed the dictatorship, who supported, how did it start?
how is economics related to this? Why did so many people just stand there and didn't do anything? So it brings a lot of other questions. That's why I think it's very powerful. It's a question that we don't want the answer itself. We want more questions so we can generate then a bigger, more meaningful answer. No, it's okay. Yeah, I like talking.
I want to just add on to that question because when you talk about the 1 foot in, 1 foot out,
Yeah.
of like within institutions, and then we talk about who killed, and we're talking, it's not about an individual, but the institutions generally want it to be blamed on an individual so it doesn't challenge the system.
Yeah.
So how do, say, activists in this space sort of say, oh, we still believe in the institution? Like I think, say here on this continent, we talk about like particularly a lot of First Nations people talking about abolition and not being able to be in the police force. And Chelsea Wadigo writes about that in the book another day in the colony of her previous husband who got broken by the Queensland police force. And there's a lot out there today around the Queensland police force. And I just wonder how activists, there's also a racial element there as well, which you could go into as well around different positions in activism and how they might approach that institutionalization of something like police force, but other institutions as well. So
Yeah,
just sort of that comment, your idea around that trust or belief is still that you can be within, it's still inside the institution as an activist.
yeah. I think it's a very, very good way that you put it. But I think that is the reason why occupying institutions are so important for my participants, or the people who participate in my research, because they have the power, the power for, they have more means of symbolic production, they have more means of material production. So that's where actually you can change things in a broader sense. That's how you can publicize, that's how you can get money enough to publicize this on mainstream media. That's where you can get the money to make big projects and travel around like they did in Brazil with the amnesty caravans. They went to, because Brazil is too big, they went to small cities and trying to collect testimonies from victims in these small cities that were never heard in the whole life. And that was done by the government. And if you have like a small collective or an activist group, that would be much more difficult. And of course, this same government that was doing this was also, for example, during the World Cup that killed people in the favelas as well, that removed people from their homes. They were investing in a heavy police, was actually military in Rio de Janeiro. They put the military in the favelas to try to end crime and the drug war and etc., all these things. So the same state, the same institutions that were doing these things that activists were criticizing, they are also doing, because they are too big. There are different departments, different offices, different politicians, different people involved. So I think that's why, again, I think it's important to consider institutions and to be critical about them. But yeah, trying to occupy, to use institutions in your favor. But yeah, you can't stop being critical to institutions, and you can't stop taking your work to the street as well. I think you can do both. And if you have more places where you can put your feet in, put your feet in. That's what I think, and that's how my participants express themselves about the importance of institutions. Nowadays, many of them work for institutions. Some of them are still activists, but some of them work for institutions that receive more fund from the government or work for the government itself. So yeah, I think it's constantly trying to occupy spaces without losing criticism about these spaces.
Like we've held you here for a very long time.
No, thank you for all the questions. I love discussing about this. And if you want to keep talking about this after, let's talk about this.
And actually, I think there's a good connection because I think the next thing we're seeing, we've got the keynote from Marcelo.
Oh yeah, that will be very, very good.
Might be able to pick up some of these.
Yeah, totally.
But maybe it's another round of applause.